Calvin Hawthorne slapped the foreclosure notice down on the courthouse steps like he was swatting a fly, loud, deliberate, and without a single flicker of shame. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He just walked right up to the posting board in front of half the town of Duskwater and nailed that paper to the wood with one clean strike of his fist, then turned around wearing the kind of smile that belongs on a man who's already decided how the story ends. Mercer Ranch, he announced to no one and everyone, loud enough that old Mrs. Patton dropped her groceries on the boardwalk. 48 hours. He pulled out his pocket watch, gold, polished, the kind a man buys to remind others he has money, clicked it open, and looked at it the way a hawk looks at a field mouse from 200 feet up. Give or take. Nobody said a word. Because in Duskwater, Arizona, 1883, nobody with good sense argued with Calvin Hawthorne, and the ones who had tried were either broke, gone, or both. That notice had one name on it, Rowan Mercer. And somewhere out on the dust road heading back from Tucson, that man had no idea his entire life was pinned to a board for the whole town to gawk at. If you've ever been the last person to find out that everything you worked for is already gone, you know exactly how this story feels. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because trust me, you will not see what's coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The ride back from Tucson took 3 days, and Rowan Mercer spent most of it trying not to think. That was his method. Had been since he was 19 years old and watched his father sign away a third of the ranch to cover a debt that wasn't even real. Since then, Rowan had learned that thinking too hard about certain things was like pressing on a bruise. It didn't fix anything, it just hurt more. So he rode. He kept his eyes on the horizon the way a man does when he's carrying something heavy inside and doesn't want it to spill. The horse, a big roan he called Pepper, moved with the steady rhythm of an animal that understood silence. Good horse. Better than most people Rowan had known. He had the bounty money in his saddlebag, $460 in paper and coin, wrapped in oilcloth, and a court receipt showing he'd delivered one Gerald Finch, wanted for armed robbery, to the Tucson Marshal's office without incident. Without incident was doing a lot of work in that sentence. There had been 2 broken ribs, a knife cut along his left forearm, and a 3-day chase through country that didn't want anyone riding through it. But the job was done. The money was there. And for the first time in almost 2 years, Rowan was calculating whether he had enough to make the next payment on his parents' debt and still have something left over for repairs on the south pasture fence. I was working that number in his head, not quite smiling, but close, when Pepper came around the last ridge above Duskwater and the town spread out below him in the early afternoon light. He noticed something was wrong before he could name what it was. People were on the street but not moving right. They were standing in clusters, the way folks do when something has happened and nobody knows what to do next. A few of them looked up toward the ridge when he appeared, and something about those faces, the way they dropped their eyes too fast, sent a cold wire of unease straight through his chest. Rowan touched his heels to Pepper's flanks and came down the slope at a steady walk, not rushing. Rowan Mercer had long ago learned that rushing toward bad news didn't make it better, and sometimes it made it worse. He'd covered about 200 yards of Main Street when Tom Greeley stepped off the hardware store porch and held up one hand. Tom was 60-something, built like a fence post, and had been a friend of Rowan's father for 30 years. The look on his face right now was the same one he'd worn at the funeral. "Rowan," Tom's voice came out rough. "I need you to hear something before you get to the board." "What board?" Tom glanced sideways, the way men do when they've got words they don't want to say. "Hawthorne posted a notice, this morning, right up front where everybody'd see it." He paused. "Says the ranch reverts to his holding company in 48 hours, unless you meet a condition." Rowan looked at him for a moment without expression. "What condition?" Another pause, longer this time. Tom pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, and that small, nervous gesture told Rowan more than any words were going to. "Says you have to be legally married by sunset tomorrow." The word married sat in the air between them like something that had dropped from a great height. Rowan didn't react, not outwardly, not in any way a stranger would notice, but his hands tightened once on the reins, then deliberately loosened. He had a habit of controlling his face the way he controlled his body in a fight. Everything deliberate, nothing wasted. "Show me the notice," he said. Tom walked with him to the posting board. The paper was official, court seal, proper signatures, the whole thing. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure it was legal. Rowan stood in front of it and read every word twice, slowly, the way you read something when you're hoping to find a mistake. There wasn't one. The language was precise and merciless. Due to a morality clause in the original land deed, buried in the fine print of the financing agreement his father had signed 14 years ago, ownership of the Mercer Ranch could only pass to, or be retained by, a married man. The clause had never mattered before because his father had been married when he signed it and married when he died. But it mattered now. And Hawthorne had known about it the whole time. Probably had his lawyers looking for it while Rowan was out on the trail bringing in outlaws to pay off fabricated debts. 48 hours. Married. Or the ranch was gone. Rowan stepped back from the board. "How long has Hawthorne known about this clause?" he asked. Tom rubbed the back of his neck. "My guess? Since before your daddy signed the original." That landed like a fist to the sternum. Rowan let it land. He stood there on the main street of Duskwater with the sun burning down and the whole town trying to look like it wasn't watching him. And he let that reality settle in the way cold water settles. It goes everywhere, fills every crack, and doesn't stop until it reaches the bottom of you. His father had been trapped from the beginning, and Rowan had spent 6 years riding hard country and taking dangerous jobs and bleeding on strangers' floors trying to pay off a debt that was never meant to be paid. It was designed to expire exactly like this, with Rowan owning nothing and Calvin Hawthorne owning everything. He turned and walked back to where Pepper was standing, untied the reins without a word, and led the horse toward the stable. Tom followed. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Rowan said honestly, because that was the truth. He had been in bad situations before, real ones, where the options were all versions of terrible, but he'd never been in one where the enemy wasn't a man he could track, corner, and drag back to face a judge. This was a trap made of paper and law and fine print, and those were the hardest kind to break out of. He paid for Pepper's stall, carried his saddlebag to the small room he kept above the livery when he was in town, and sat on the edge of the cot. He laid the bounty money on the mattress in front of him. $460. Enough to cover 3 months of debt payments, maybe 4 if he stretched it. None of that mattered now. He was 31 years old. He had been riding alone since 25. He'd had exactly one relationship that came close to serious, and it had ended the way most things in his life ended, with him leaving for a job and coming back to find the situation had changed without him. The woman in question, a schoolmaster's daughter named Ruth, had told him plainly the last time they spoke that she couldn't love a man who treated danger like a daily errand. He hadn't argued. She wasn't wrong. Since then, he had not tried again. Not because he didn't want to, because he was self-aware enough to know what he was offering any woman, a life inside a fence painted with targets, beside a man whose enemies kept a running count. That wasn't a gift. That was a burden. And now he needed to find a woman willing to take that burden before the sun went down tomorrow. He sat with that for a long time. Long enough that the light through the single window shifted from harsh afternoon yellow to the softer orange of early evening. Then he heard the horses. Not one horse, several, coming fast from the east road, the kind of speed that meant trouble or urgency or both. A moment later, voices carried through the wall, shouting. Then a woman's voice, sharp and clear above the noise, saying something Rowan couldn't make out from where he sat. He was on his feet and out the door before he'd consciously decided to move. The stagecoach, or what was left of it, had come in at a hard angle and stopped crooked in the middle of the road 50 yards from the livery. 2 of the 4 horses were still hitched, but breathing hard, foaming, their eyes showing white. The driver was on the ground being helped up by 2 men from the feed store. A woman was standing on the step of the coach with blood on her sleeve, not her own by the look of it. She was too steady on her feet, too focused, pressing a cloth against the shoulder of the man beside her with practiced efficiency. Rowan walked over. The story came in pieces, the way stories always do at the scene of chaos. 6 bandits. 3 miles out on the east road, where the canyon walls came close enough together to funnel traffic into a bottle. They'd taken the strongbox, shot the guard, the man the woman was pressing the cloth against, and would have taken the passengers too if one of the bandits' horses hadn't bolted when the shooting started, creating enough confusion for the driver to whip the team and run. "Is he going to make it?" Rowan asked. The woman looked up at him for the first time. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-20s maybe. brown hair coming loose from its pins, one cheek smudged with what looked like road dust and dried tears. Her eyes were dark and direct in a way that caught him off guard. Most people, when they're scared, can't look straight at you. She was looking straight at him. "He needs a doctor," she said. Not panicked, just clear. "The bullet is still in there. If someone doesn't take it out tonight, he's going to develop fever and then infection." "Doc Haverford is on Mill Street," Rowan said. "Third building from the end." He looked at the two men from the feed store. "You two, get him there now, carefully." They moved. People tended to move when Rowan Mercer told them to. He had that quality. Not loud, not aggressive, just a steadiness that communicated, without any performance at all, that he knew what he was talking about and you should probably listen. The woman stepped down from the coach. Up close, she was taller than he'd first assessed, and the expression on her face was doing something complicated. She was holding herself together, but just barely, the way a person does when they've been holding it together for a long time and they're not sure how much longer the walls will hold. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do much. You organize things." She glanced at the two men already carrying the wounded guard down the street. "People needed someone to tell them what to do. You did that." He didn't answer that. He was already cataloging her, not romantically, just as habit. Traveling alone, no escort, no husband visible. Single bag on the roof of the coach, practical size. Dressed for travel, not display. School teacher or governess, probably. The way she'd kept her head in a crisis wasn't nothing. "You headed somewhere specific?" he asked. "Millhaven. I have a position at the schoolhouse there. Or I did." Something crossed her face, something older and harder than anything else about her. "I'm not sure what I have anymore." There was a story in that sentence, and he didn't ask about it. Not yet. Her name was Clara Winslow. She told him that much when he offered to carry her bag to the hotel, since the stagecoach wasn't going anywhere until morning. She told him she was from Ohio, that she'd been teaching for 4 years, and that she had come west because she'd run out of reasons to stay east. He didn't push on that last part either. She asked him, while they were walking, what he did. He told her. Bounty hunter, 6 years. She didn't flinch, just nodded slowly, the way someone does when information arrives that confirms something they'd already suspected. "That must be lonely," she said. He looked at her sideways. Most people didn't say that. Most people said something about danger or law or justice, not loneliness. "It has its moments," he said. She didn't push on that either, and for some reason that made him more comfortable with her than he'd been with most people in years. They got to the hotel. He carried her bag to the front desk. She thanked him again. He nodded and turned to go, and he'd made it nearly to the door when Tom Greeley appeared in the entrance, breathless, coat half on, like a man who'd run the whole way. "Rowan, I've been looking for you everywhere." "I'm right here." Tom looked between Rowan and Clara, seemed to calculate something, then lowered his voice. "Hawthorne just moved the deadline. His lawyers filed an amended notice with the county judge. They're saying circumstances changed, that there's a risk you'll attempt to falsify a marriage certificate. They're pushing it to tomorrow morning, first light, not sunset." The word hit Rowan like the flat side of a board across the face. Not 48 hours. Not even 24 now. He stood very still. Clara Winslow, from somewhere behind him, said quietly, "What's happened?" He turned. She was watching him with those direct dark eyes, and there was something in her face that he couldn't quite categorize. Not pity, not curiosity exactly. More like the face of someone who has heard a door slam shut and wants to understand what was behind it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, because he was a man who had never been good at dressing things up in softness, he didn't feel, he said exactly what was in his head. "I need a wife," he said. "By first light. And I have nobody to ask." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rowan Mercer had heard in years. Clara didn't laugh. She didn't step back. She just looked at him with an expression that was impossible to read, and then said slowly, like someone testing the weight of each word, "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Leave nothing out." So he did. He told her about his father's debt, about the clause buried in the deed, about Hawthorne, about 6 years on the trail, about the $460 in his saddlebag, and how it had stopped meaning anything about 3 hours ago. He told her without apology or performance, just the plain unvarnished shape of it, the way you tell the truth when you're too tired to do anything else. She listened without interrupting. That alone set her apart from most people he knew. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What would it mean for me, practically, if I agreed?" "It would be temporary, in name. I'd have a lawyer draw up a private agreement. Your rights protected, no obligations you didn't choose. As soon as the ranch is secured and Hawthorne's claim is dead, we'd file for dissolution, and you could continue to Mill Haven with your position intact and nothing lost. And if something went wrong with that plan, then you'd have a better lawyer than me." Something almost like a smile moved across her face. Almost. That's not exactly reassuring. "No," he admitted. "It's not." She looked at the desk clerk, who was pretending very hard to be interested in his ledger. She looked at Tom Greeley, who had the decency to examine his boots. Then she looked back at Rowan. "Let me think," she said. "You have until—" "I know what the deadline is," she said quietly. "Let me think." He nodded, turned, walked out of the hotel into the duskwater night, where the stars were coming out over the Arizona high desert, and somewhere across town, Calvin Hawthorne was sitting in his big house counting things that weren't his yet. Rowan stood on the boardwalk and breathed. He was not a man who prayed, he was not a man who begged. But standing there in the dark, with the weight of everything pressing down from above and below and sideways, he found himself doing something he hadn't done since his father died. He just stood there and hoped. Not for anything specific, just hoped. The way you do when specific hopes have run out and you're down to the bare raw thing underneath. Inside the hotel, Clara Winslow sat alone at the small writing table in her room, and she thought about Ohio, about the schoolhouse, about what it felt like to lose everything that was supposed to be yours, through no fault of your own, and what it cost a person to start over. She thought about the look in Rowan Mercer's eyes when he told her about his father, about how he'd described 6 years of riding dangerous country to pay off a debt, not with heroism, not with pride, but with a kind of quiet exhaustion that told her he'd never once thought of himself as doing anything exceptional. He'd just been doing what needed doing. She recognized that feeling. She knew it from the inside. She sat at that table for a long time. Through the thin wall, she could hear the sounds of the town settling into night. Somewhere a horse shifted in its stall. Somewhere a dog barked once and went quiet. Clara Winslow picked up her pen, then put it down, then stood up, opened her door, walked down the stairs and straight out the front of the hotel, and found Rowan Mercer exactly where she'd guessed he'd be. Standing in the dark on the boardwalk, not going anywhere, not running, just standing there the way a man stands when he's decided to face whatever comes. She stopped 3 feet from him. He turned. "All right," she said, "but I have conditions." And for the first time since he'd ridden into Duskwater and seen those faces turned away from him in the street, Rowan Mercer felt something shift, just slightly, just enough, in the weight pressing down on his chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't hope. It was something more dangerous than either. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were not yet decided. Her conditions were not what he expected. Rowan had braced himself for demands about money, or legal guarantees spelled out in precise language, or some kind of exit arrangement, so airtight it would take a Tucson lawyer 3 hours to draft. He'd been prepared for all of that. He'd been prepared to negotiate, to give ground, to promise things he wasn't certain he could deliver. Instead, Clara Winslow stood on the boardwalk in the duskwater night and said, "I want to meet the ranch before I agree to anything." He stared at her. "Tonight?" "You said first light is the deadline. That gives us a few hours." She crossed her arms, not in defiance exactly, more the way a person does when they're holding their own resolve in place from the outside. "I'm not agreeing to attach my name to something I've never laid eyes on. I've done that once before in my life and it cost me everything I had." She paused. "So, can we go tonight or not?" Rowan looked at her for a long moment. The night air was cool and smelled like dust and sage and the particular dry emptiness of Arizona after dark. A lamp flickered in the window of the hotel behind her. "It's 4 miles out," he said. "I walked farther than that to get to the stagecoach station in Ohio." He almost said something, stopped himself, went and got Pepper. They rode out in silence for the first mile, Clara on a rented mare from the livery, a steady brown animal named, according to the stable hand, Biscuit, which seemed like an undignified name for a horse that moved with reasonable competence. Clara had not complained about the name or the horse. She'd just checked the cinch herself, adjusted the stirrups without asking for help, and swung up with the ease of someone who'd been around horses before, but not necessarily recently. Rowan noticed that. He noticed most things. It was the skill that kept him alive in his work, the ability to read the small true signals people sent out without meaning to. What he was reading from Clara Winslow was that she was frightened and trying very hard not to show it, and that the effort of not showing it was costing her something real. "You said you'd lost everything," he said, when the lights of Duskwater had fallen behind them. "Back in Ohio." She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily beneath them, the sound of hooves soft on dry earth. "My parents died 18 months apart," she said. "First my father, then my mother. I had a younger brother. He went to live with our aunt in Cincinnati because she had more room and more money than I did." She said it plainly, without self-pity, the way people describe old wounds that have scarred over but still pull when the weather changes. "I had a house that turned out to have a lien on it I didn't know about, a teaching position that paid $40 a month, and a very clear understanding that Ohio was finished for me." A short pause. "The position in Mill Haven paid $60 and came with a room. That's why I'm on a stagecoach in Arizona." Rowan didn't say he was sorry. He'd found that sorry, offered by strangers, tended to land wrong. Instead he said, "Your brother, is he all right?" She seemed surprised by the question. "He's 11. He's adjusting." Another pause, smaller this time. "He writes me letters. He uses too many exclamation points, which I think means he's trying to seem happier than he is." "Kids do that." "Yes." Her voice went quiet on that single word in a way that told him she thought about those letters more than she let on. They didn't speak much after that, but the silence was different than it had been on the way out of town. It had lost its edges. The ranch came into view when the moon cleared the ridgeline, a cluster of dark shapes against a dark sky. The main house and the barn and the outbuildings arranged with the particular logic of a place that had been built by people who understood land and work rather than aesthetics. The fencing needed attention. Rowan knew that. The south pasture gate hung at an angle that had been bothering him every time he came home, and the paint on the main house was peeling in a way his mother would not have tolerated. He watched Clara look at it. She took her time. She didn't say anything for almost a full minute, and he found himself doing something he rarely did, actively wanting to know what someone else was thinking. "It's not what I pictured," she said finally. "What did you picture?" "Something smaller." She turns to look at the barn, the pasture beyond. "Something more worn down. The way you described it, the debt, the years, I thought it would look defeated." She paused. "It doesn't. It looks like it's been waiting." He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he got off the horse and tied Pepper to the fence post and walked to the front porch without comment. Clara followed, and when he opened the front door and held the lamp high enough to throw light into the main room, he watched her face move through something complex and private. The inside of the Mercer ranch house was not a showpiece. The furniture was old and heavy and had been repaired in places with varying degrees of skill. The kitchen still had his mother's hook rack beside the stove, 3 hooks, 2 of them still holding aprons that nobody had touched since the funeral. There were books on the shelf by the window. His father's books. A Bible worn soft from handling that Rowan had kept, but never opened. Some livestock almanacs. A battered copy of Moby Dick that his mother had read twice and claimed not to understand but clearly loved. There was a crack in the plaster above the fireplace that had been there since Rowan was 9 years old. There was a quilt on the back of the settee that his mother had made from scraps of worn-out clothing, each piece a different texture and color, the whole thing ugly as sin and somehow exactly right. Clara walked to the quilt and touched the edge of it very lightly with her fingertips. She didn't say anything. Rowan stood in the doorway and watched her and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was close to embarrassing, the feeling of wanting someone to see something clearly and being not quite sure why it mattered so much. "My mother made it," he said. "Unnecessary. She'd probably figured that out." "I know," Clara said. "You can tell." She turned from the quilt to look at him directly. "What was she like?" Nobody asked him that. Not in years. "Practical," he said. "Stubborn when she thought she was right, which was most of the time. She laughed at things that weren't that funny and then got embarrassed about laughing." He stopped. "She was good to people. Not in a performance, just naturally." Clara nodded slowly. "She sounds like someone worth fighting for." The sentence arrived and sat there. Rowan cleared his throat. So, he said, you've seen it. I've seen it. She turned back toward the door, back toward him, and her face had settled into something he couldn't quite read, but that seemed more resolved than it had been an hour ago. Tell me your conditions, she said, since I told you mine. That surprised him into something almost like a laugh. My conditions. This goes two directions, she said evenly. You need something from me. I may need something from this arrangement beyond legal protection. Tell me what you expect. He leaned against the door frame, thought about it seriously, the way she seemed to require. I don't expect anything, he said slowly. That's the honest answer. You'd have your own room, your privacy. I'm gone most of the time anyway. That wouldn't change immediately. He paused. I'd want you to be honest with me about whatever you needed or didn't need. I don't do well with people who say one thing and mean another. Neither do I, she said. And I'd want you to be safe, he added, and that came out quieter than intended, with a seriousness that hadn't quite been planned. Whatever arrangement we agree to, I don't want it to cost you something you can't get back. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not the near smile from earlier, something more complicated, less guarded. All right, she said, I'll do it. The ride back to Duskwater was faster. There was a different quality to the silence now, purposeful rather than tentative, two people moving toward something rather than circling it. Tom Greeley was still awake when they got back, sitting on the steps of his hardware store with a lantern and the particular expression of a man who has been worrying for several hours and is not going to admit it. When he saw them ride up together, he stood up so fast he nearly knocked the lantern off the step. You found someone, he said, and then looked at Clara with something between relief and awkwardness. Ma'am, I apologize for this whole situation isn't... It's fine, Clara said. She was already thinking practically. We need a justice of the peace, tonight, and a lawyer to draft a private agreement before anything is signed. Tom blinked, then looked at Rowan. She's organized. She is, Rowan said. Justice Arlo Pennick lived above the dry goods store and was not pleased about being woken at 11:30 at night. He came to the door in his nightshirt with his white hair pointing in 4 different directions and a look on his face that suggested he was actively considering retiring from public service. When Tom explained the situation in the compressed, apologetic way Tom explained things he was nervous about, Pennick stood in his doorway and said nothing for so long that Rowan began to think he was going to refuse. Then Pennick looked at Clara. You're doing this of your own free will? I am, she said. Nobody's coercing you? Nobody's promised you something they can't deliver? He's promised me a private legal agreement and a room of my own, she said. And he told me honestly that he can't guarantee it works out. That's more honesty than I've gotten from most people, so yes, my own free will. Pennick looked at her for another long moment, then at Rowan. Then he sighed the sigh of a man who has accepted his fate. Let me get my coat, he said. The private agreement was drafted by Ellis Wade, the only lawyer in Duskwater who kept late hours, largely because he was an insomniac with a complicated relationship with whiskey and paperwork. He was also, underneath all of that, thorough and fair. He had the document ready in 40 minutes. Clara read every word of it. She caught one ambiguity in the property clause and made Wade rewrite it. Rowan watched her do this without interfering because she was right and he knew it. They signed the agreement at 12:53 in the morning. The ceremony itself took 6 minutes. Pennick was efficient when he wanted to be. There were no flowers, no music, no assembled guests beyond Tom Greeley and Ellis Wade as witnesses. The lamp on Pennick's kitchen table threw a yellow light that was not flattering to anyone. Rowan's hands were dry and Clara's were slightly cold when they briefly touched at the moment Pennick indicated, not quite a handshake, not quite a hold. When it was done, Pennick said, You may, and then stopped himself, reading the room with more perceptiveness than anyone had given him credit for, and simply said, You're legally married. Congratulations to you both. And then went back to bed. On the walk back to the hotel, because the plan was for Clara to continue at the hotel until proper arrangements could be made, neither of them spoke for almost a block. It was Tom who finally broke it, unable to help himself. So, that happened. That happened, Rowan agreed. Clara, walking slightly ahead of both of them, said nothing. But Rowan, watching the set of her shoulders in the lamplight, thought she did not look like someone who had made a terrible mistake. She looked like someone who had made a very difficult decision and was living with the weight of it in real time, which was different. They parted at the hotel door. Clara said goodnight in a voice that was composed and a little formal. The voice, Rowan guessed, that she used when she needed to get through something without letting it show. He nodded. Tom made a small, unnecessary sound. Then she was inside and the door was closed. "She's something," Tom said. Rowan didn't answer that. "What happens at first light?" "I file the marriage certificate with the county clerk the moment the office opens," Rowan said, "before Hawthorne's lawyers can file anything else. And then? And then we'll see what Hawthorne does next." He looked at Tom. "He won't stop. This isn't over because of a piece of paper. He'll push another angle." Tom rubbed his jaw. "You knew that going in." "Yes. And you still—" "There wasn't another choice," Rowan said simply. "There wasn't." He didn't sleep much that night. He lay on the cot above the livery and stared at the ceiling and thought about the ranch, about the quilt on the settee, about Clara's fingertips touching the edge of it, about what she'd said. "It looks like it's been waiting." He wasn't sure what he thought about that sentence, only that it had lodged somewhere inside him and wouldn't shift. At 5:30 he was up. At 6 he was at the county clerk's office, waiting on the step. The clerk, a nervous young man named Dobbins, who was aware of exactly who Rowan Mercer was and what he'd come for, processed the certificate with admirable speed and zero editorial comment. Rowan had the stamped copy in his hand by 6:20. He was walking back down Main Street when he saw Hawthorne's carriage. It was parked in front of the hotel. Not the county clerk's office, the hotel. And that was wrong, because there was no legal business Hawthorne should have at the hotel. There was no angle from which Calvin Hawthorne had any standing to be at the hotel at 6:20 in the morning, and Rowan Mercer knew the angles. He picked up his pace. The front room of the hotel was tense in the way rooms get when something has happened just before you arrived. The desk clerk was pressed against the back wall with the expression of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. Two of Hawthorne's men, wide, suited, the kind of men who were expensive to hire and didn't ask questions, were standing in the middle of the room. And Hawthorne himself was at the base of the stairs, one hand on the newel post, looking upward with the patient, proprietary expression of a man who was used to waiting for things to come to him. Clara was at the top of the stairs. She'd clearly dressed quickly, hair half pinned, jacket not quite buttoned at the top, but she was standing very straight, and her face had the particular set of someone who was not about to come one step further down those stairs. "Simply want to have a conversation," Hawthorne was saying, in the smooth, reasonable voice that Rowan had heard him use before, the one designed to make perfectly unreasonable things sound like logic. "There's no need for this to be unpleasant. You're a young woman who's been placed in a very difficult position by a man whose life makes him dangerous to be near, and I merely want to make sure you understand your options before—" "Mr. Hawthorne," Rowan's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of a sound that stops other sounds. Hawthorne turned slowly. His face arranged itself into something that was technically a smile. He was in his 50s, well-fed, with the groomed confidence of a man who had been the most powerful person in most rooms for a very long time. His eyes were pale gray and did not participate in the smile. "Mercer," he said pleasantly. "Good morning. I was just speaking with your wife, I understand. Recent development. Congratulations are apparently in order." "Get out of this hotel," Rowan said. "Now I'm simply— You don't have business here. You don't have standing here. And if your men don't move toward that door in the next 10 seconds, I'll remove them myself, and the removing will not be gentle." He said this without raising his voice, without any change in expression, with the same complete steadiness he brought to everything. "The certificate is filed. It's done. Whatever clause you buried in that deed is satisfied and the ranch is mine, clear and legal. You're finished here." Something moved in Hawthorne's pale eyes. Not fear. Men like Hawthorne didn't fear individuals easily. It was more like calculation, a rapid, invisible adjustment of position, the way a chess player's expression shifts when an unexpected move has been made. "For now," Hawthorne said softly. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him, unhurried, deliberate, turned it once in his hands. "The law is a flexible instrument, Mercer. You should know that better than most." He glanced up at Clara with an expression that was meant to look sympathetic and was actually contemptuous. "My apologies for disturbing your morning, Mrs. Mercer." He said the name the way a man says a thing he doesn't believe in. Then he walked out. His men followed. The door of the hotel closed behind them, and the room seemed to exhale. The desk clerk slowly peeled himself off the back wall. Rowan looked up at the top of the stairs. Clara came down them steadily, not hurrying, not fleeing, just walking, the way she did most things, with a self-possession that cost her something invisible. When she got to the bottom, she stopped 3 feet from him, which had become, he realized, her particular distance, close enough to talk quietly, far enough to have her own air. "How long was he here before I arrived?" Rowan asked. "About 5 minutes." She paused. "He wanted me to accept a payment, to say that the marriage was coerced, that I'd signed under duress." Another pause. He had a figure already prepared, written down on a card like a business transaction. Rowan looked at her face. "What did you say?" "I said I'd need time to consider it," she said, and when she saw his expression shift, "because I wanted to know what he'd say next. He told me that you had a history of violence, which you've told me yourself is true in a professional context, that you were an unstable man to be around, that he was doing me a kindness." She tilted her head slightly. "He believes his own framing. That's interesting." Rowan stared at her for a moment. "You were reading him." "I taught school for 4 years," she said. "You learn very quickly how to tell the difference between someone who actually wants to help and someone who wants something and is using helpfulness as the packaging. Despite everything, the lack of sleep, the filed certificate in his coat pocket, the lingering cold feeling that Hawthorne's visit had left in the room, Rowan felt something almost like relief, not because the situation was better, because he was not, as it turned out, alone in understanding it. That afternoon he drove her out to the ranch in the wagon. Not for any legal reason, the filing was done, but because she'd seen it in the dark, and that wasn't quite the same thing. And because the alternative was leaving her at the hotel with nothing to do but sit with the weight of what she'd agreed to, which seemed like a poor way to treat someone who had just done him an enormous favor at considerable personal cost. The ranch in daylight was different, not better or worse, just honest. The sun showed every needed repair with the impartial clarity of good light on old wood. The south pasture gate hung wrong in a way that was more visible now. 3 fence posts on the west line needed replacing. The barn roof had a section where the weathering had gone far enough that winter rains were going to be a problem. Clara walked around the property slowly, systematically, the way she'd read the lawyer's agreement. Not casually, but with her full attention applied evenly to everything she looked at. She asked questions, practical ones. How much grazing land? What did the water situation look like in dry season? How many head of cattle was the operation running before his parents died? He answered each one straight, including the parts that weren't good news, because that seemed to be what she wanted, and probably what she deserved. "You could rebuild this," she said, standing at the edge of the south pasture, looking across the dry grass toward the ridge line. "It's not in as bad a shape as you probably think it is from the inside." She turned to look at him. "When you're the one keeping something alive by yourself for years, you stop being able to see it clearly. You only see what's going wrong." He hadn't thought about it that way. He wasn't sure he entirely agreed, but he wasn't sure he disagreed either. "There's a school in Millhaven," he said. "You had a position there." She was quiet for a moment. "I know. I'm not saying you should give that up. The agreement stands, whatever you need." "I know that too," she said. She looked back at the pasture. "Let me think about it." She seemed to need that phrase, "let me think," the way some people need a handhold before they commit to the next step. He was coming to understand it not as hesitation, but as precision. She didn't say things until she meant them. That quality, he was discovering, was rarer than it should have been. They were back in the wagon heading toward town when they heard the rider coming from the north at a speed that didn't belong to ordinary afternoon travel. Both of them registered it at the same time, that particular urgency in hoofbeats that reads differently from ordinary movement. The rider was a boy from the ranch 2 miles north of the Mercer property, Danny Hale, 14 years old, whose family ran a modest cattle operation that had been barely surviving for the past 2 years. He pulled up beside the wagon with his horse breathing hard and his face the color of old paper. "Mr. Mercer," he said, and then stopped, like the words had gotten tangled on their way out. "Easy," Rowan said. Breathe. What's happened?" "Men," Danny said. "Armed men. They came to our place this morning, said they were there representing a land company, said my father had 48 hours to vacate. The boy's voice cracked on the last word, and he forced it back into steadiness with visible effort. My father told them to leave. One of them hit him. A pause. He's all right, but Mr. Mercer, there's more. Carver Tillis is back. The name landed on Rowan like a drop in temperature. Clara looked between them. Who is Carver Tillis? Rowan was already thinking through angles and didn't answer immediately. Carver Tillis was an outlaw, the specific kind. Not disorganized or desperate, but methodical and territorial, the kind who ran operations rather than just crimes. Rowan had been close to bringing him in twice. The first time, a source had turned unreliable. The second time, Tillis had left the territory so fast, it suggested he'd known Rowan was coming before Rowan had told anyone he was coming. He'd been in New Mexico the last Rowan had heard. 7 months ago. Apparently he was back. He's been hired, Rowan said, partly to himself, and then looked at Danny. By whom? Did the men give a company name? Territorial Resource Holdings, Danny said. That's what they said. Clara was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, that's Hawthorne. Rowan looked at her. The accountant at my father's bank back in Ohio had a practice of creating subsidiary company names for legal purposes, she said. Shell companies. They always sounded legitimate. Territorial Resource Holdings is exactly the kind of name Calvin Hawthorne would use to hide behind. She met his eyes. He didn't just want your ranch, Rowan. He wants the whole valley. The valley. 8 ranches. Probably 300 families across the connected properties, if you counted the smaller operations and the homesteaders on the edges. People who had been out here for decades, who had built things in hard ground under hard sun, who were now looking at 48-hour notices delivered by hired men who had already demonstrated they were not above using their hands. And somewhere riding point for all of it was Carver Tillis, who was not a reasonable man and was not going to be handled with legal filings. Rowan sat with that for a moment. Then he handed the reins to Clara. She took them without being asked, and turned to Danny. Go home. Stay with your father. Don't let anyone on the property tonight, and don't make any moves. Tell your father I'll come by in the morning. Danny nodded, turned his horse, and was gone at the same urgent pace he'd arrived. Clara held the reins and looked at the road ahead. Her jaw was set in a way Rowan was beginning to recognize. This is bigger than we thought, she said. Yes. He moved fast. The timing of Tillis arriving, the subsidiary company, the simultaneous pressure on multiple ranches, he had this plan before he ever posted that notice on the courthouse steps. She paused. The notice was a distraction, or a test, to see how you'd respond. And how did I respond? She glanced at him sideways. You got married and filed the paperwork before sunrise. A brief pause that was almost wry. He probably didn't predict that exact outcome. No, Rowan said. Probably not. They drove back toward Duskwater in the long golden light of late afternoon, and for the first time since he'd ridden back into town and seen those turned-away faces, Rowan's mind was working cleanly, not with panic, not with grief, but with the particular focused calm that came over him. When the situation finally revealed its real shape, and he could start thinking about how to meet it, he was going to need to talk to every rancher in the valley. Tonight or tomorrow, at the latest. He was going to need to know how many of them had already received notices, how many were armed, how many had hands they could trust. I was going to need a plan that didn't depend on him being in 6 places at once, because that was the kind of plan that got people killed. And somewhere out on the north approaches of the valley, Carver Tillis was riding with armed men and a contract that probably included provisions for property damage, intimidation, and whatever else it took to clear the land. This was not going to end with a marriage certificate. Clara pulled the wagon up in front of the livery and handed him back the reins. She sat for a moment looking at the street, at the ordinary business of late afternoon Duskwater moving around them, people who didn't yet know that the ground under the whole valley had shifted. What do you need from me? She said. Practically. He looked at her. Clara. Don't, she said quietly. Don't tell me it's not my problem. I signed the same paper you did. This land has my name on it now, too. She turned to look at him directly. So tell me what you need. Rowan Mercer sat beside his wife of approximately 14 hours on the seat of a wagon on the main street of Duskwater, Arizona, and understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrived in unlikely moments, that whatever he'd expected this arrangement to be, it had already become something else entirely. He wasn't sure yet if that was frightening or necessary. Standing in front of the livery, watching a hawk circle silently above the ridgeline to the north, he suspected it was both. The valley meeting happened the next morning in the Mercer barn. Rowan had ridden to 5 properties before sundown the previous evening, and Tom Greeley had covered 3 more on foot and horseback through the night, which was the kind of thing Tom did without being asked and without expecting credit for it. By 7 in the morning, there were 11 ranchers seated on hay bales and upturned crates in the barn, plus a handful of older hands who'd come with their employers and were standing along the wall with their hats in their hands and their expressions carefully neutral. Clara had made coffee. Not because anyone asked her to, and not because it was her role. She'd found the pot and the grounds and done it practically, the way she did most things. And now there was coffee, and 11 men who hadn't slept enough were holding tin cups and being slightly less brittle than they would have been otherwise. Rowan stood at the front of the barn near the open door and looked at the assembled faces. He knew most of them, some since childhood, some from the years since his parents died when he'd come back to find the community frayed and thinned by exactly the kind of pressure they were now all facing at once. Jacob Hale, Danny's father, had a bruise under his left eye that had gone the color of old storm clouds. He hadn't mentioned it when Rowan came through the night before and Rowan hadn't asked. "Everyone in this barn has received a notice or knows someone who has," Rowan said. He didn't preamble. These were people who'd been up since before dawn and were carrying real fear and didn't need it managed for them. Territorial Resource Holdings is a shell company. It belongs to Calvin Hawthorne. The goal is to consolidate the valley, all of it, under one ownership before anyone can respond individually. He paused. That's the plan. We're past the point of guessing about it. A man named Dougal Ferris, who ran the easternmost property in the valley and had more acres than anyone else in the room, said, "How do you know it's Hawthorne?" "Because I know his methods," Clara said. Every head in the barn turned toward her. She was standing near the far wall with her coffee cup, and she met the collective attention without flinching. The subsidiary company structure, the simultaneous pressure on multiple properties, the use of a hired enforcer to do the physical intimidation, while the legal notices remain technically clean. She paused. Calvin Hawthorne didn't build his financial operation in this territory by being original. He uses the same pattern every time. He used it in 2 other counties before he came to Duskwater, and he'll use it again somewhere else if he succeeds here. Another beat of silence. Ferris looked at Rowan. "Who is she?" "She's my wife," Rowan said. It was the first time he'd said those words out loud in a context that wasn't a legal office, and they landed differently than he expected. He moved on before anyone could dwell on it. "She's also the most useful person in this room right now, so pay attention to what she says." Clara didn't acknowledge that. She was already looking at the group with the particular focus of someone who has assessed a problem and is working through its components. "The legal notices give 48 hours, she said. That's the official timeline. But Hawthorne didn't hire Carver Tillis to stand around waiting for legal deadlines. Tillis moves when Tillis decides to move." She looked at Rowan. "Which means we probably have less time than the paper says." That shifted the room. The men who'd been listening with arms crossed began uncrossing them. Jacob Hale set his coffee cup down on the nearest surface and didn't pick it up again. "So what do we do?" Hale said. Rowan had been thinking about this since the night before. He'd run it through the way he ran every difficult situation, methodically, without romance, looking for what would actually work rather than what felt right. "We don't scatter," he said. "That's the first thing. If every man goes back to his own property and tries to defend it alone, Tillis picks us apart one at a time, and he's good at that. He's very good at that." He let that land. "We consolidate. Anyone with children or elderly on the property, get them to town tonight. Anyone with livestock that can be moved, bring them here, to the Mercer pasture. We hold one position, together, and we make it not worth the cost to take." "You're asking us to abandon our homes," Ferris said. "Temporarily, strategically." Rowan met his eyes. "I'm asking you not to die defending an empty house when the people inside it are what actually matter." That particular sentence went around the room the way significant sentences do, quietly, with everyone processing it at their own speed. "I have 12 hands," said a woman near the back. Rowan hadn't seen her come in. Margaret Alcott, who ran the Alcott property on the valley's southern edge after her husband passed 3 winters ago. She was in her 60s, built like a woman who had spent every decade of her life doing the work of two people, and she was looking at Rowan with the direct, unimpressed attention of someone who had heard a lot of plans in her time and was evaluating this one on its merits. My hands are good. Half of them can shoot. What's the plan when Tillis actually comes? Rowan looked at her. How good are they? Good enough, she said. No inflation, no false confidence, just the flat assessment of someone who knew what she had. We don't start a war, Rowan said. If shooting starts, it'll start from their side. What we need to do is make it clear, before it gets that far, that taking this valley is going to cost more than it earns. He paused. Tillis works for money. His men work for money. Hawthorne works for profit. If we make the math wrong, if we make this position cost more to break than the land is worth to acquire, they stop. And if they don't? Ferris asked. Then we hold, Rowan said, and we send for the territorial marshal. The marshal in this territory is in Hawthorne's pocket, Hale said. Not all of them. The federal marshal out of Phoenix isn't, and a federal complaint about organized criminal intimidation of homesteaders carries different weight than a local dispute. Rowan looked at Clara without quite intending to. She was already nodding. I can write the complaint, she said. I know the legal language. If someone can get it to a writer heading south tonight, it's in Phoenix by day after tomorrow. A different quality settled over the barn after that. Not confidence exactly. These were people who knew enough to be cautious about confidence. But something more solid than panic. A direction. A set of actions that could be taken, which was better than the feeling of waiting for something terrible that you couldn't influence. By noon, the Mercer Ranch had more people on it than it had seen in years. Clara hadn't planned to become the organizational center of the operation, but she found herself there anyway. The way capable people often find themselves in positions nobody officially assigned them. She kept a list of who was arriving, who had children, who needed the barn versus the outbuildings, which families had specific needs. Marta Hale was 7 months pregnant and needed the main house rather than a barn floor. Old Silas Ferris, Dougal's father, was 81 and had a cough that suggested the dusty barn would not serve him well. Clara put him in the room she'd been using, gave him the better blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed, and moved her own things to the small room off the kitchen without comment. Rowan, passing through the kitchen on his way to the south fence line, stopped when he saw her carrying her bag. You don't have to do that. Someone needs that room more than I do, she said. It's not a sacrifice. It's arithmetic. He looked at her for a moment. Are you all right? The question surprised her into a pause. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. She set this bag down and turned to face him properly. There were lines of fatigue around her eyes that hadn't been there 2 days ago. I'm managing, she said, which was more honest. There are a lot of people here, and most of them are frightened, and I'm trying to give them something useful to do, so they don't sit in corners frightening each other. That's taking most of my concentration. A pause. I keep thinking about those children, and whether we made the right call bringing everyone here, rather than sending them away from the valley entirely. If we'd sent them away, their families wouldn't have stayed to fight, Rowan said. People don't hold their ground when what they're holding it for is somewhere else. She looked at him. That's either very wise or very cynical. It's just true, he said, which was, she thought, a very Rowan Mercer answer. He left to check the fence line. She went back to her list. By 3 in the afternoon, Rowan had positioned men he trusted at the 3 main approaches to the ranch: North Road, East Ridge, South Pasture Gate. Not armed aggressively, just present invisible and capable, which was the point. He'd walked the defensive perimeter twice with Margaret Alcott's foreman, a lean, quiet man named Pike, who had a military bearing he'd never explained and didn't need to. Pike had caught 2 things Rowan had missed on the first pass, and Rowan had adjusted accordingly without ego about it. He needed the best plan, not the plan that was entirely his. The attack, when it came, didn't come from any of the 3 approaches Rowan had covered. It came at 4:40 in the afternoon from the dry creek bed on the western edge of the property, a route that wasn't on any maps, that Rowan himself barely remembered from childhood explorations, that would have required someone with local knowledge or very careful prior scouting. 14 men. Carver Tillis at the front, not hiding at the back the way most hired operation leaders did. He was on a gray horse, and he was moving at a pace that was not quite a charge, but was several steps past a casual approach. The first shot came from the tree line before any of Rowan's people had a chance to react, not aimed at a person, aimed at the barn, and it went through the upper wall with a sound like a board being split by an axe. Somewhere inside the barn, a child screamed and then was quickly, fiercely shushed by an adult. That sound, the scream and the shushing, went through Rowan like a current. He'd been at the windmill on the western edge of the property when the creek bed movement started, which put him closer to the initial breach than anyone else, and farther from the main house than he wanted to be. He had his rifle and his sidearm and approximately 4 seconds to make a decision that was going to shape everything that followed. He didn't charge toward Tillis. That was what Tillis would expect. What the Rowan Mercer reputation suggested he would do. The direct confrontation, the bounty hunter coming straight at the target. Instead, he moved laterally, fast, toward the fence line where Pike had his men positioned, because the defensive line was worth more than any individual action Rowan could take alone. The next few minutes were noise and motion and controlled chaos. Shots from Tillis's riders, answered by fire from the fence line. Not a firefight exactly, more the particular tense exchange of people testing ranges and positions, everybody trying to understand the geometry of what they'd walked into. 2 of Tillis's men pulled back immediately, which told Rowan they were hired hands with limited commitment rather than true believers. That was useful information. What he didn't see was Clara. He had a fraction of a second to register that absence. She was supposed to be inside the main house with the children and the elderly. That was where she'd been when he last checked. And then he was moving again because standing still in this situation was a way to become a target. He found her 3 minutes later, not in the house. She was at the barn door, not running toward the fighting, which would have been suicidal, but moving in the opposite direction with the deliberate, low-profile movement of someone who knew not to be tall when there were bullets in the air. She had 2 children by the hand, the younger Hale boy, maybe 4 years old, and a girl Rowan didn't immediately recognize, and she was taking them toward the root cellar at the back of the property, the old stone structure his father had built into the hill, the kind that would stop bullets. She moved fast and she moved smart, and she didn't look panicked, even though her face was the color of chalk. He watched her get the cellar door open and get both children inside, then turn back toward the house. She saw him watching from 20 yards away and said, in a voice pitched to carry but not to shout, "There are 3 more children in the house. The cellar's safer." "I know," he said. "Go, I'll cover the approach." She went. He covered it. The next 40 minutes were the kind of time that doesn't move the way regular time moves. It expanded and compressed in ways that had nothing to do with clocks. Rowan worked the perimeter, not heroically. There was nothing heroic about it, just the relentless, grinding, physically exhausting work of keeping a defensive position organized, while people on the other side were actively trying to find the weak spots in it. He was shouting across the fence line to Pike about the southeast corner when he heard the unmistakable sound of someone coming up close behind him. He turned. Carver Tillis was 10 yards away, on foot. He'd come around behind during the perimeter movement, while the attention was on the southeast corner. He had a rifle on his shoulder pointed at the center of Rowan's chest, and he had the look of a man who had done this very thing a number of times and found it straightforward. "Drop it," Tillis said. Rowan looked at him. Tillis was not what people imagined when they pictured an outlaw leader. He was narrow, almost slight, with a trimmed beard and eyes that were neither wild nor stupid. He was, in the way that truly dangerous people often were, entirely ordinary looking. The rifle in his hands was steady. Rowan did not drop his weapon. He also did not raise it. He stood still, which was a third option Tillis might not have anticipated. "You and I have been close to this moment twice before," Rowan said. "And both times you didn't close it," Tillis said. "I've thought about why. Because the first time you got out of the territory before I could corner you, and the second time someone warned you I was coming." Rowan kept his voice conversational, which was difficult given the rifle. "I've wondered for 2 years who that was." Something moved in Tillis's expression. Barely. Just a fraction of a shift that most people would not have caught. "Hawthorne," Rowan said. Not a question. Tillis said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "He's been playing both sides the whole time," Rowan said. "He hired you for this operation, but he's also the one who burned your last 2 jobs in New Mexico by tipping off local law when you stopped being useful to him. Did you know that?" A longer silence. The rifle didn't waver, but something in the quality of Tillis's stillness changed. "You're trying to talk yourself out of a corner," Tillis said. I'm telling you something true, Rowan said. Check it yourself when this is over. Hawthorne doesn't keep partners. He keeps tools. And when a tool stops being useful, enough. Tillis's voice was flat. But the rifle, Rowan noticed, had shifted 2 degrees. Not down, just 2 degrees to the right of center. It was the smallest thing in the world, and it was everything. The shot came from Rowan's left. Not aimed at him, aimed past him, into the fence post 3 feet from Tillis, close enough that the splinter spray caught the edge of Tillis's cheek. Tillis moved on instinct. Everyone moves on instinct when a shot comes that close. And in the fraction of a second that the rifle swung off target, Rowan closed the distance. What followed was not graceful. It was fast and brutal and ended with Tillis on the ground, the rifle out of his hands, and Rowan on top of him with a weight and leverage advantage he was not going to waste by being sentimental about it. Don't, Rowan said. He had Tillis's wrist at an angle that made the word entirely persuasive. Tillis stopped moving. From his left, Clara appeared. She was holding a long-barreled shotgun she'd taken from the rack inside the barn. He recognized it as the one his father had kept for coyotes, which meant she'd had the presence of mind to remember it was there, find it, load it, and use it with enough accuracy to put a shot 3 feet from a man's face and not hit the man behind him. She lowered the barrel and looked down at Tillis with an expression that was completely steady. That was a warning, she said. I'm a decent shot. My second one won't be a warning. Tillis looked up at her for a long moment, then at Rowan, then back at her. You picked an interesting wife, he said to Rowan. I'm becoming aware of that, Rowan said. Without their leader actively directing the assault, Tillis's hired men did what hired men do when the calculation changes. They stopped. Not all at once, not orderly, but within 10 minutes of Tillis going down, the shooting had tapered to nothing, and 2 of the riders were visibly pulling back toward the creek bed. It was the particular collapse of an operation that was never ideological to begin with, just contractual. When the contract starts looking like it leads somewhere fatal, reassessment happens fast. Pike's voice carried across the yard. East side is clear. Then from the south fence, south is clear. Rowan looked at Tillis, who was now sitting up with his hands held in front of him in the universal posture of a man who has decided this particular fight is over. Your men go, Rowan said. All of them. Now. And you stay. What are you planning to do with me? Hold you until the federal marshal arrives, Rowan said. Then let him decide. Tillis appeared to run the arithmetic on that. Federal versus local. The federal angle had been Clara's idea, had gone out with a rider the previous night, and if it landed right, if the complaint had been received and taken seriously, there was a decent chance the federal office was already moving. Tillis seemed to understand from some professional corner of his experience that the ground under this situation had shifted in ways that weren't visible from where he was sitting. Fine, Tillis said. It was not a glorious surrender. It was a practical one, which was its own kind of ending. The ranch settled into an exhausted, fragile quiet as the afternoon light began its long tilt toward evening. People moved back out of the cellar, out of the house, into the yard with the stunned, slow-motion quality of those who have just come through something they weren't sure they would come through. Children were found and held. Jacob Hale's wife, the pregnant Marta, who had been in the root cellar the entire time and who had, by her own later account, gripped the hand of the younger Hale boy so hard that he still had the marks on his palm 2 days later. She walked out into the evening air and stood very still and breathed it in for a long time before she moved again. Clara was sitting on the edge of the old stone watering trough when Rowan found her. She had her hands flat on her knees and she was looking at nothing in particular. The shotgun was on the ground beside her. She'd been carrying tension in her shoulders for so many hours that their sudden lowering made her look for a moment like someone 10 years older. Rowan sat down beside her. Not close. Just within the range of the particular distance she kept around herself. Are you hit? He asked. No. A pause. Are you? He checked the obvious places. His left arm had a cut from a fence splinter, bleeding but shallow. His knees were both going to be impressive shades of purple tomorrow from the ground. Nothing serious, he said. She looked at his arm, stood up without comment, went inside, came back with a cloth, and the small bottle of antiseptic Clara apparently kept in her bag, because she was Clara and of course she did. She cleaned the cut with a businesslike efficiency that involved no fuss and a slight, involuntary hiss from Rowan that he would not have admitted to if asked. Hold still, she said. I am holding still. You're wincing. Wincing and holding still aren't mutually exclusive. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but near it. She tied off the cloth bandage and sat back down beside him. Closer this time, fractionally, possibly without noticing. That shot, Rowan said. At Tillis, that was... He stopped, because the words available were inadequate. Brave was the obvious one, and he discarded it immediately because it was the word people used when they meant something bigger and couldn't find the right language. What she had done was take a heavy shotgun she'd never fired before. He was fairly certain of that. Find a position and angle that avoided hitting him, and put a round into a fence post 3 feet from a dangerous man's head, while her hands were presumably doing something other than staying perfectly calm. I couldn't get a clear shot at him, she said, as though this were a straightforward logistical comment. You were in the line, so I aimed for the post. A pause. I was hoping that would be enough. What if it hadn't been? She looked at him sideways. Her eyes in the late afternoon light were darker than they looked indoors. Then I would have tried something else, she said. You figure it out as you go. That's all anybody does. He looked at her for a moment, long enough that she seemed to notice, and the set of her expression became slightly more careful. What? She said. Nothing, he said. But it wasn't nothing. He knew that and suspected she knew it too. It was the particular recognition of someone who has watched another person operate at full capacity under pressure. Not their performed self, not their careful self, but the actual self that emerges when there's no time to be anyone but who you are. What he had seen today was who Clara Winslow actually was, and it was not what anyone in Duskwater would have predicted from the young schoolteacher who'd arrived on a damaged stagecoach 2 nights ago. As the sun descended behind the western ridge and the valley settled into its particular blue-gray dusk, the Mercer ranch yard filled with the low sound of families beginning to breathe again. Someone had started a cook fire near the barn. Margaret Alcott's foreman, Pike, was organizing a night watch with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that it wasn't over yet, just paused. Tom Greeley had appeared at some point in the confusion. Rowan wasn't sure exactly when, and was now moving through the yard with cups of something that may or may not have been entirely coffee, performing the particular social ministry of a man who understands that people need to feel attended to almost as much as they need to be safe. Rowan looked across the yard at all of it. 11 families, more than 30 people. The children were eating. The animals in the pasture had settled. The old ranch house had lamplight in every window, which it hadn't had in years. Not since his parents were alive, and this place was full in the way a home is full when it's actually being lived in rather than held on to. Something moved in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. Your father would have liked today, Clara said beside him. Not because of the violence or the difficulty. He understood that. Because of the yard full of people. Because of the lamps. He looked at her. How do you know that? Because of the quilt, she said simply. People who make quilts out of scraps of worn-out things, they're the kind who collect the people around them the same way. Nothing wasted, everything kept. Rowan looked back at the yard. He thought about his father signing that original paper. About a trap built into the language of a deed, designed 14 years before it was meant to spring. About 6 years of riding dangerous country and coming home to an empty house and leaving again, because staying and watching it slowly go was somehow harder than the leaving. He thought about a $460 bounty receipt folded in his coat pocket that no longer meant what he'd thought it meant when he'd been riding home 3 days ago. 3 days. That was all it had been. Clara, he said. Thank you. It came out quieter than intended, and without the careful neutrality he usually maintained, just the plain shape of the thing. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had the same plainness in it. No performance, no deflection, just the real thing. Don't thank me yet, she said. Hawthorne's still out there. I know. This isn't finished. I know that too. She nodded, looked at the yard. The cook fire had caught properly and was throwing orange light across the faces of the people gathered around it. And in that light, the tired, frightened, relieved expressions of 11 families who had survived today looked something like what they acted in a place and were going to fight to stay in it. Tillis was secured in the old equipment shed with 2 men on watch and a padlock that had been on that door since Rowan was 12. His men were gone, scattered back toward whatever arrangement they had with Hawthorne, carrying with them the information that this operation had not gone as planned and that the man they'd been riding for had not shown up when the actual shooting started, which was information that would do its own quiet damage to Hawthorne's position. Tomorrow there would be more to deal with. Rowan knew that with the certainty of a man who understood how people like Hawthorne operated, not in single strikes but in sustained pressure, wearing down opposition through repetition and resource and legal maneuvering when the other tools failed. The federal complaint was moving, but federal complaints move slowly. The Valley Ranchers were united for now, but unity under pressure was a perishable thing that needed constant tending. There was still the question of Hawthorne's forged contracts, the fabricated debts, the full scope of what had been done to how many families over how many years. That story was larger than Duskwater. It was probably larger than the territory, and unpacking it properly was going to require more than Rowan Mercer's rifle and Clara Winslow's shotgun. But that was tomorrow. Tonight the yard was full of lamplight, and the smell of food and the sound of children who had stopped crying, and Rowan Mercer sat on the edge of a stone watering trough beside a woman he had known for 3 days and understood better than people he had known for 30 years, and let himself have this 1 hour that wasn't about what came next. Just this. Just the evening. Just the impossible, stubborn fact that the ranch was still standing. Across the yard, old Silas Ferris, 81 years old, cough and all, was telling a story to 3 children who were supposed to be going to sleep. His voice was too low to make out the words from where Rowan sat, but whatever it was, one of the children laughed, a high, bright, uncomplicated sound that went up into the Arizona night and disappeared into the stars above the ridge. Beside Rowan, Clara tipped her head back and looked up at the same stars. He looked at her looking at them, and for the first time in 6 years, Rowan Mercer did not feel like a man holding something together alone. The morning after the ranch held, Rowan woke before anyone else. That was habit more than intention. 6 years of sleeping light in places where morning sometimes brought company he hadn't invited. He lay on the floor of the main room, which he'd given up to a family with 3 children, and stared at the ceiling while the ranch house breathed around him with the particular sound of too many people sleeping in a space built for fewer. Someone was snoring in the kitchen. A child made a small, half-conscious sound from the direction of the settee and went quiet again. He got up slowly, careful not to step on anyone, and went outside. The yard was gray and cool and smelled like the dying cook fire, and the horses in the pasture and the dry sage beyond the fence line. He stood on the porch for a long moment and looked at the property the way he always did in the early morning, checking it, the way you check something you care about and are not entirely sure is safe. The equipment shed where Tillis was secured was quiet. Pike's night watchmen were at their posts, both of them awake, which was more than he'd expected after the previous day. He was still standing there when the porch board behind him shifted and Clara appeared in the doorway with 2 tin cups. She handed him one without preamble. The coffee was hot. He had no idea when she'd gotten up or how she'd managed it without waking anyone, but it was the kind of thing he was coming to understand was simply how she operated, quietly, practically, solving problems that hadn't been officially identified as problems yet. "Tillis talked last night," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at her. "To who?" "To me." She held her cup in both hands. "Pike's man let me in around midnight. I told him I wanted to check the bindings, which I did, they were fine, and Tillis started talking." She paused. "I think he wanted to. I think he'd been sitting in there calculating his position and reached the conclusion that talking was better than not talking." "What did he say?" "Hawthorne's financial operation is built on a foundation of altered documents," she said. "Not 1 or 2, systematically altered. Loan agreements with clauses added after signing. Deed transfers recorded with different terms than what the original parties agreed to. He's been doing it for at least 12 years in this territory, possibly longer." She looked at her cup. "Tillis said Hawthorne keeps his own records, a second set of books. Everything documented, which is what men like that do," Rowan said. "They keep records because they think they'll never be found and because they want to know exactly how much they're owed and by whom." "Yes." She looked at him. "Tillis knows where the records are kept." The weight of that settled between them in the cool morning air. "He'll want something in return," Rowan said. "He wants the federal marshal to know he cooperated before sentencing," Clara said. He's not asking to go free. He seems to understand that's not realistic. He just wants it noted. She paused. I told him I couldn't promise anything on behalf of any federal authority. He said he understood that and would take his chances. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. You negotiated with Carver Tillis at midnight. Someone had to, she said mildly. You were asleep. He should have had an answer for that. He didn't. He drank his coffee. The federal marshal arrived 2 days later, which was faster than anyone had expected, and which suggested that Clara's complaint, written at the kitchen table in the hour before the attack, in the precise, structured language of someone who understood what legal documents needed to say to be taken seriously, had landed with more weight than a routine complaint would have carried. Marshal Everett Dawes was out of Phoenix, 50 years old, with a face like a closed barn door, and the deliberate, unhurried movements of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by what people were capable of doing to each other for money. He read Tillis's statement. He read the complaint. He listened to Rowan for 20 minutes and to Clara for 30, and the extra 10 minutes he gave her was, Rowan suspected, because she communicated information more efficiently and with better structural logic than most people he dealt with. Then Dawes looked at the stack of materials on the kitchen table and said, Where are Hawthorne's private records? In the floor safe of his private office, Clara said. On the second floor of the Hawthorne building in Duskwater. Tillis knows the combination. He was given it during the operation planning in case he needed to retrieve documents on Hawthorne's behalf. She paused. He said Hawthorne trusted him with it because Hawthorne trusted no one but liked having people who thought he trusted them. Dawes looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. You'd have made a good marshal, Mrs. Mercer. I'm a teacher, she said. But thank you. Rowan watched the exchange and said nothing. He was doing the thing he did sometimes, standing slightly back, observing, processing. What he was processing was the particular way Clara had said, I'm a teacher, rather than I was a teacher, which was a tense he had not heard her use before, and which carried inside it the small, quiet weight of a decision she apparently had not announced. He didn't mention it, not then. Dawes took Tillis into federal custody that afternoon and rode for Duskwater with 2 deputies. Rowan went with them. He did not ask Clara if she was coming. She was already at the wagon when he walked to the hitching post, sitting on the seat with her bag in her lap and the patient expression of someone who had already decided and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. They didn't speak much on the ride in. There wasn't a great deal to say that hadn't already been said, and both of them had arrived by slightly different routes, at an understanding that the next few hours were going to require a different kind of attention, the concentrated, forward-facing kind, not the kind that looked sideways at things that were complicated and unresolved. What was complicated and unresolved was essentially everything between them that wasn't logistical. Rowan knew it. He suspected Clara knew it too. They were handling it the way 2 pragmatic people handle something they're not ready to address, by focusing intensely on the 14 other things that needed addressing first. Duskwater received them in the way small towns receive significant events, with the combination of outward calm and barely contained agitation that comes from everyone knowing something is happening and nobody being willing to be the first to say it. People were on the street in larger numbers than a regular afternoon warranted. The news of the ranch attack and its outcome had traveled the way news travels in small territory towns, fast, imprecise, and with the particular embellishments that come from multiple retellings. Rowan heard a version, third-hand from Tom Greeley, on the steps of the hardware store, in which he had single-handedly disarmed 9 men, and Clara had shot the hat off Tillis's head from 40 yards, neither of which was accurate, but both of which were more dramatic than what had actually happened. The hat part is better than the truth, Tom admitted. The truth is also impressive, but hats are funnier. Stop telling people about the hat, Clara said. I didn't start that one, Tom said, with genuine innocence. The arrest of Calvin Hawthorne happened at 4 in the afternoon and was, in the way of things that have been a long time coming, both exactly what Rowan had hoped for and somehow still shocking to witness. It was the accountant that broke it, not because Dawes had pressured him, or because Tillis had named him specifically, though Tillis had named a great many people in his statement, with the thoroughness of a man who has decided that cooperation is his best remaining option. The accountant's name was Bernard Cleves, and he had worked for Calvin Hawthorne for 9 years. And for 9 years he had been keeping the second set of books that Tillis had described, the real records, The ones that showed what had actually been agreed to versus what had been filed. The ones that would unravel 12 years of fraud in a territory that had been too geographically scattered and too legally underserved to notice what was being done to it. Cleves had not apparently felt good about any of it. This was not the same as stopping it, which he had not done, but it meant that when Marshal Dawes appeared in the Hawthorne building with a federal warrant and the particular authority of someone who has come from Phoenix specifically for this purpose, Cleves made a decision with the speed of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to give him a reason to make it. He handed over the books himself, both sets. He opened the filing cabinet in Hawthorne's private office, pulled out the leather folders he'd been maintaining for 9 years, and set them on the desk in front of Dawes without being asked. "I should have done this a long time ago," Cleves said, which was true and insufficient, and the kind of thing a person says when they know it's true and insufficient and can't think of anything better. Dawes looked at the folders, then at Cleves. "You'll need to make a statement." "I know," Cleves said. "I'm ready." Hawthorne was in the building when it happened, in the front office on the ground floor behind his desk, with the particular composure of a man who had spent 12 years in this territory doing things that should have had consequences and hadn't, and had come to believe in the way such men do, that the absence of consequences so far was evidence of permanent immunity rather than delayed reckoning. He saw Dawes come down the stairs with the folders. He saw his own accountant behind the marshal with the expression of a man who has made a confession and is still deciding whether it has made him feel better or worse. And something in Hawthorne's face went through a series of rapid changes that Rowan, standing near the door, observed with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this particular sequence. First, the instinct to negotiate. You could see it, the slight gathering of professional composure, the preparation of a reasonable voice. Then the calculation, checking angles, looking for the exit, the way a man does when he's used to having exits. Then the realization that the exits were covered, the books were in federal hands, and his own accountant was standing right there. Then something that was not quite the face of a man who has been caught, so much as the face of a man who has run out of moves. It was more frightening than anger in its way. It was the expression of a structure collapsing inward. "Mr. Hawthorne," Dawes said, with the formal courtesy of a man who finds formality useful in these moments. "I'm placing you under federal arrest on charges of fraud, document falsification, and criminal conspiracy. There will be additional charges pending review of these materials." He indicated the folders. "You have the right to send for a lawyer. I'd suggest you do that." Hawthorne looked at Rowan. Not at Dawes, not at Cleves, not at the folders that contained 12 years of his own careful deceptions. At Rowan Mercer, who was standing near the door with his arms at his sides and an expression that was, for once, entirely unguarded. Not satisfaction exactly, not triumph. Just the face of a man who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed to put it down. "This isn't finished," Hawthorne said. His voice was different than usual. The smooth reasonableness was gone. What was underneath it was colder and more precise and probably truer. "You think a federal filing ends this? I have lawyers in 4 cities. You have lawyers," Rowan said quietly. "So do the 43 families whose documents are in those folders." He paused. "My wife is a good writer. She's been drafting letters to every territorial newspaper between here and the capital since yesterday morning. By next week, every family you've touched will know what was done to them and who did it." Another pause. "Good luck with your lawyers, Calvin." He used the first name deliberately. He'd been Mr. Hawthorne for 6 years. He was done with that. Something in Hawthorne's eyes went very flat and very still. Then Dawes's deputies moved, and Calvin Hawthorne was escorted out of his own building in front of a gathering crowd of Duskwater residents who had begun assembling on the street the moment word spread that something was happening at the Hawthorne building, because in small towns, word always spreads before the thing itself is over. Rowan watched him go, stood there until the door closed and the sound of boots on the boardwalk outside diminished, and the office was quiet. Clara appeared beside him. He hadn't heard her come in. "Cleves will testify?" she asked. "Dawes thinks so." He said Cleves seemed relieved. "People often are," she said, "when they finally stop carrying something they shouldn't have picked up in the first place." A pause. "What about the families? The debt contracts?" "The fraudulent ones will be voided once the documents are reviewed. That's months of legal work, maybe more. But it'll happen. He turned to look at her. The letters you've been writing. Someone needs to, she said simply. People can't fight what they don't know about. And 43 families in different parts of the territory, sitting separately with their individual injustices, thinking they're alone in it. She stopped. They're not alone in it. They should know that. He looked at her face in the afternoon light coming through the office window. The light that fell differently in here now, that Hawthorne wasn't the kind of presence that seemed to change the quality of a room. She looked tired. She'd looked tired for 3 days. She was also, underneath the tiredness, more settled than she'd been when she arrived on that damaged stagecoach. Not because things were easier, because she was doing something that mattered, and she knew it, and that made a difference to certain kinds of people. Clara Winslow was that kind of person. You said I'm a teacher, Rowan said. This morning. Not I was. She looked at him. A small pause. Yes. The position in Mill Haven is still there if I want it, she said. I checked. The schoolhouse doesn't open until September. That's 2 months. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not going anywhere right now. There's too much to do here. A shorter pause. And she stopped. And you what? She looked away from him briefly, at the middle distance, and when she looked back, her expression had the particular quality of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is still in the process of deciding how to say it. The ranch, she said finally. I keep thinking about the ranch, about what it could be, not just what it is. She stopped again. That's probably not a practical thing to say. No, he agreed. It's probably not. He looked at her for a moment longer. Say it anyway. She looked at him, measuring something. Then, you've been fighting to hold on to a place for 6 years, fighting for the shape of it, the legal ownership, the deed, the debt. And that's necessary. I understand why. But a place isn't just what's on the paper, it's what happens inside it. She gestured vaguely, which was unlike her. She was usually precise. That barn full of people. The children eating. Tom Greeley with his whatever it was in those cups. Old Silas telling stories to the kids. A pause. That's what the ranch is. That's what you've been fighting for, not just the acreage. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. I know, he said. Do you? I do now, he said, and meant it. There was a stretch of silence that was not uncomfortable. Through the window, the sounds of Duskwater going about its altered afternoon carried in. Voices, horses, the particular buzz of a community that has just witnessed something significant and is in the process of absorbing it. There's something else, Clara said. She set her cup down on the edge of Hawthorne's desk with a small, careful click. The private agreement we signed, the dissolution clause. She was watching him with the careful, direct attention she brought to things that mattered. I want to talk about it. His chest did something that wasn't quite a lurch but was in the vicinity of one. All right. The agreement is legally sound, she said. I know that. Ellis Wade is thorough. She paused. I also know that it was written in the middle of the night under considerable pressure and that it was what the situation required at the time. Both of us understood that going in. Yes, he said carefully. And the situation has changed, she said, which means what we require has also, possibly, changed. She stopped, and something in her expression was doing something he had not seen before, not the careful composure or the practical focus or the near smile. Something underneath all of those, less managed. I'm not good at this, she said, which surprised him, because she was good at almost everything she attempted. Neither am I, he said. I know. The corner of her mouth moved. I've noticed. Then we're even. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the complicated, unresolved thing that had been sitting between them since that first night on the boardwalk in Duskwater, the thing they'd been handling by focusing intensely on 14 other things, was there, squarely in the room, not going anywhere. The agreement gives me the right to walk away, she said. I'm aware of that. And I want you to know... She stopped again, started differently. I want you to know, whatever I decide, it's mine. Nobody's obligated here. That was the point of the agreement. Yes, he said. So. She held his gaze. What do you want? Not what the agreement says. What do you want? Rowan Mercer had been asked a great many questions in his life, under a great many types of pressure. He had answered questions while bleeding. He had answered questions with rifles pointed at him. He had answered questions in courthouses and jails and the dusty back offices of territorial marshals. He was not, as a rule, a man who had difficulty with words in practical situations. This was not a practical situation. I want... He stopped. Started again. I want to not be the reason you give up something you came a long way to get to, he said. That's the first thing. If Millhaven and the school is what... I told you I'm not going anywhere right now, she said. Right now. Right now is what I have, she said, and there was an edge in her voice that wasn't impatience. It was something closer to conviction. I'm not someone who plans 10 years out and holds to it regardless of what changes. I tried that. It doesn't work. A pause. I know what right now is. Right now is I'm at a ranch in Arizona with a husband I've known for 4 days who is... She stopped. Who is not what I expected, she said finally. What did you expect? I don't know. Less. The word landed with a precision she clearly hadn't quite intended, and the near smile appeared more fully than usual. Less than you are, she clarified, though the clarification made it worse in a different direction, and she seemed to know it. Rowan looked at her for a moment and then did something he rarely did. He laughed. Not a big sound, not a performance, just the involuntary release of something that had been under pressure for too long. It caught him off guard. It seemed to catch her off guard too, because she looked at him with something startled and then laughed herself, briefly, and the office felt entirely different after that in a way neither of them could have precisely described. When it settled, they were still looking at each other, but the quality of the looking had changed. The careful distances they both maintained, her 3 feet, his particular neutrality, had shifted by some small, unannounced fraction. I want you to stay, Rowan said. Quiet, direct, no decoration. Not because of the legal situation or the agreement or the ranch, because... He stopped and said the rest of it the way he said most true things, plainly, without expecting it to sound better than it did. Because I haven't wanted someone to stay in a very long time, and that's probably inadequate as reasons go. It's not inadequate, she said, equally quiet, equally plain. They stood in Calvin Hawthorne's empty office in the horizontal afternoon light, and the moment stretched in the particular way of moments that are not going to repeat themselves, held, suspended, belonging to itself. Then Clara picked up her bag from where she'd set it against the wall and said, We should get back to the ranch. Marta Hale needs someone to check on her, and Tom Greeley is probably telling the hat story to everyone in the yard. The hat story, Rowan said. The hat story, she confirmed. He held the door. She walked out into the duskwater afternoon, and he followed, and neither of them said the thing that had just been said in the office, because there was no need to. It was said. It was there now, part of the air between them, not going anywhere. They were halfway down the main street when Tom Greeley detached himself from a cluster of people near the posting board, the same board where Hawthorne had nailed the foreclosure notice 4 days ago, and which now held a different kind of document, something Dawes had left posted before riding out. A federal notice of criminal proceedings, bearing Hawthorne's name and the list of charges in the impersonal, official language of federal law. Tom looked at both of them with the expression of a man assembling a situation from visible evidence. Well, he said. Don't, Rowan said. I wasn't going to say anything. You had a face. I have a face, Tom said with dignity. It's the only one I've got. He looked at Clara. You doing all right? I'm fine, she said. You keep saying that. Because I keep being fine. Tom appeared to evaluate this and accept it. Cleves is at the courthouse, he said, shifting to business with the ease of a man who knew when he was being redirected. Wade's with him. Dedue's left 2 deputies to handle the processing here before transporting Hawthorne to Phoenix. He paused. There's talk of a community meeting tonight. People want to know what happens next with the debt notices. The families who got the 48-hour papers. Tell them the notices are void pending federal review, Clara said, and that anyone with a Territorial Resource Holdings document should bring it to Ellis Wade's office tomorrow morning. He's going to need to see all of them to build the complete picture for the federal complaint. Tom pulled out a small notebook. You want to come to the meeting and say that yourself? People respond better to... Yes, Clara said, before he'd finished the sentence. Tom wrote something down, looked at Rowan. You too. I'll be there, Rowan said. Tom nodded, closed the notebook, and then looked between them one more time with the infuriating perceptiveness of a man who had known Rowan Mercer since he was 15 years old. "Something's different," he said. "Goodbye, Tom," Rowan said. Tom went, wearing the faint, pleased expression of a man who considers himself an excellent reader of situations and has just confirmed it to his own satisfaction. Clara watched him go. "He's going to tell people." "He's not going to say anything specific," Rowan said. "He'll just radiate." "Radiate," she repeated. "He does that. When he thinks he knows something. You'll see." She considered that. "I'll see," she said, and the particular emphasis on the future tense of it, not "I would see, but I will," was so small and so precisely placed that Rowan wasn't entirely sure she'd done it intentionally. He thought probably she had. Clara Winslow did very few things without some degree of intention. He thought about that on the ride back to the ranch in the wagon, with the sun getting long and the shadows running ahead of them on the road, and the dry Arizona evening settling over everything in the gold and copper way it had in these hours. He thought about intention, about how she'd read the legal agreement for ambiguities at midnight and caught the one Wade had missed, about how she'd written the federal complaint in an hour under pressure, about how she'd taken his father's shotgun from the barn wall and put a warning shot 3 feet from a dangerous man's face, not because she was fearless, but because she made calculated decisions faster than fear could stop her. And he thought about what she'd said in Hawthorne's office, not the part about the ranch, though that had mattered. The other part. Less than you are. The way she'd said it and then looked at him when she understood she'd said more than she'd planned to. He'd been a man that people were cautious around for 6 years. Respectful, some of them genuinely so, but cautious. Because of what he did and how he did it and the residue that left on a person's reputation. Most people related to him through a degree of wariness that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with what he represented, which was the reminder that the world had dangerous edges, and some people spent their lives working those edges professionally. Clara had seen the dangerous edges. She'd been present for them several times now in ways that were not abstract. And she had arrived, by her own visible process, at less than you are, meaning she had expected the edges and found more than edges. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He wasn't sure anyone could be sure what to do with something like that in 4 days. But he also understood, sitting in that wagon in the long Arizona evening, that 4 days was not the actual timeline. The actual timeline was 6 years of a man holding something alone, and then one night where something changed, and then 4 days of everything being tested at once. 4 days could contain a lot of real experience if the pressure was high enough. He knew that from work. He knew what you learned about a person when the pressure was high, not who they performed as, but who they actually were when there was no time to be anyone else. He knew who Clara Winslow actually was. He wasn't entirely sure what to do next about that, but he knew it. And knowing it felt, in the specific way it felt, like something he was not going to be able to unknow. The ranch came into view around the last bend, and even from a distance he could see that the yard was still occupied. Several families had stayed through the day, helping with repairs, and there was activity near the barn that looked like someone had organized a work party on the south fence without being asked. He recognized Margaret Alcott's foreman Pike, directing 3 men on the fence line, which meant Pike had stayed on his own initiative, which was the kind of thing that happened when a place started to feel worth staying for. Clara sat up slightly when she saw it. Not a dramatic gesture, just a small involuntary straightening, the way a person does when something registers as more than expected. "They stayed," she said. "They did." She looked at the yard, the people, the activity, the smoke from what was clearly a resumed cookfire near the barn, where someone was making something that was probably not good, but would be substantial. She looked at it the way she'd looked at the ranch the first night, standing in the dark. Like it was telling her something she was in the process of understanding. "It's different," she said. "Than yesterday?" "Than I thought it would be," she said. She didn't elaborate on that. She didn't always, and he had stopped expecting her to, had started instead reading the spaces around what she said, which was where Clara Winslow put the things she wasn't entirely ready to say out loud yet. He pulled the wagon up to the hitching post. A child came running from the direction of the barn, the younger Hale boy, the one Clara had pulled to the root cellar during the attack, and stopped 3 feet from the wagon and looked up at both of them with the directness only small children have. "Did they catch the bad man?" he asked. "They caught the bad man," Clara said. She climbed down from the wagon and crouched to his level. He's gone now. For good? For good. The boy considered this with the solemn deliberateness of a 4-year-old processing significant information. Then he said, "Mama said you're staying." Clara looked up briefly, and Rowan, who was unhitching Pepper and carefully not making eye contact with anyone, heard the small pause before she answered. "For now," she said. The boy seemed satisfied with that. He ran back toward the barn. Rowan finished with Pepper and turned. Clara was standing beside the wagon, looking in the direction the boy had gone with an expression that was private and complicated in ways he didn't try to read. "For now," he said. She looked at him. "That's enough," he said. "For now is enough." She looked at him for a long moment, and her expression did the thing it did sometimes, the thing he'd noticed early and hadn't stopped noticing, where the careful composure thinned just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath it, which was not vulnerability exactly, but was something related to it. The thing that gets exposed in people when they stop defending against something they've been defending against for a long time. She didn't answer in words. She didn't need to. They walked toward the ranch house together, in the particular evening light that turned everything in Arizona the color of old copper and new fire. And behind them the sounds of the occupied yard followed, voices, a laugh, the sound of a hammer on the south fence, a child calling to another child about something entirely unrelated to any of it. And the Mercer Ranch held all of it, the way it had always been built to do, even when nobody was sure it would last long enough to matter. The families went home gradually, the way they'd come, not all at once, but in the particular staggered way of people who have been through something together and are reluctant to let the together part end. The Hales left on the third morning, Jacob with his bruised eye faded to yellow-green and his handshake firm in a way that said more than he was comfortable saying out loud. Marta hugged Clara for a long time without explanation, and Clara hugged her back the same way. The younger Hale boy, whose name was Eli, Rowan had finally learned, stood at the wagon and waved until the ranch was out of sight, which Rowan only knew because Tom Greeley, who had stayed on through the week, because Tom Greeley never seemed to have anywhere pressing to be, reported it with the expression of a man filing away evidence for future use. Margaret Alcott was the last to leave, on the 4th day, and she didn't say goodbye so much as she delivered a final assessment. She stood in the yard with her hat in her hands and looked at the repaired south fence. Pike's crew had finished it in 2 days, straight and solid, better than it had been before, and then looked at Rowan. "Your father built this place right," she said. "You've been keeping it wrong. Keeping it like it might have to be abandoned any day." She glanced at Clara, who was on the porch with a cup of coffee, and the specific expression of someone who is listening while pretending to be interested in the middle distance. "That's changing," Margaret said. Not a question. "That's changing," Rowan agreed. She put her hat back on, climbed up to her wagon seat with the agility of a woman who had not accepted the limitations her age was supposed to impose, and drove out without looking back, which was exactly how Rowan would have expected Margaret Alcott to leave anywhere. The quiet that settled over the ranch after the last wagon disappeared down the road was a different kind of quiet than Rowan had known in the 6 years he'd been maintaining this place alone. Before, the quiet had been the quiet of absence, the sound of a house with too much empty space in it, rooms that held the shapes of people who weren't there anymore. This quiet had some weight to it, some presence. The kind that comes after a lot of people have been somewhere and left their trace on the air. He was at the barn checking on Pepper when Clara appeared in the doorway with her sleeves rolled up and a particular expression that he had learned over the past week meant she had decided something. "There's a room in the back of the house," she said. He looked up from the brush he was running along Pepper's flank. "The storage room. It's the right size for a schoolroom. 6 children in this valley alone are too far from any existing school. The Hale children, the 2 Ferris girls, the Alcott grandchildren who stay summers." She was not asking exactly, but she was watching him with the attention of someone who is aware they're proposing something that affects more than themselves. "I'd need to write to Millhaven and formally decline the position, and I'd need to order books. And there's the matter of the window in that room, which doesn't open properly and would need to be fixed before winter." Rowan set down the brush. "The window I can fix." "I know you can," she said. "That's not the part I was uncertain about." "What part were you uncertain about?" She looked at him steadily. "Whether you wanted a school on your property." He looked back at her for a moment. "I want whatever keeps you here," he said, and because that sentence was more direct than he usually allowed himself, He picked the brush back up and returned to Pepper's coat with the deliberate focus of a man who has said a thing and is done looking at it. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "The window," she said. "Whenever you have time." "Tomorrow," he said. She went back to the house. Pepper turned his head around and regarded Rowan with the flat, patient expression of an animal that has witnessed a great deal of human behavior and finds most of it unnecessary. "Don't," Rowan told him. The letter to Millhaven went out with the Thursday rider. The books were ordered from a catalog Clara produced from her bag with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this longer than she had acknowledged. The window was fixed on Tuesday, which involved Rowan discovering that the frame had been rotting from the inside since approximately 1876, and spending an afternoon replacing it entirely while Clara read dimensions to him from inside the room, and they argued with reasonable civility and occasional sharpness about whether the sill needed to be a full 3 inches or whether 2.5 would do. 2.5 did not do. He used 3. "You didn't have to give me the satisfaction of being right," she said, examining the finished frame. "I didn't give it to you. The wood required it." "That's a distinction without a difference." "That's carpentry," he said. It was the most ordinary argument in the world. It was also the most comfortable Rowan Mercer had felt inside the walls of this house since before his parents died, and he was aware of that in the way you're aware of something that would embarrass you to say out loud, quietly, privately, without looking directly at it. The federal proceedings against Hawthorne moved with a speed that surprised most people in the territory and didn't surprise Clara, who had structured the complaint specifically to foreclose the delays that territorial cases usually suffered. Bernard Cleves testified for 4 days in Phoenix. Tillis, true to the calculation he'd made that midnight in the equipment shed, provided a statement that corroborated Cleves's documentation at every significant point. The second set of books, 12 years of Hawthorne's private record-keeping, turned out to be not merely damning but comprehensive in the way that meticulous, overconfident men often make things comprehensive, because they never truly believe the records will be found. 47 fraudulent debt instruments, 31 falsified deed clauses across 4 counties, 11 properties transferred under terms the original owners had never agreed to. The total value of what had been taken, when Ellis Wade finished helping the federal examiner calculate it, was a number that ran in the Duskwater paper and caused a silence in the community that lasted approximately an hour before it turned into something louder. Hawthorne was held in Phoenix awaiting trial. His assets in the territory, the building in Duskwater, the subsidiary companies, the land holdings acquired through fraud, were frozen pending the court's disposition, which meant that every family who had lost property to territorial resource holdings was now in a position to make a claim, and Clara's letters to the territorial newspapers had ensured that most of those families knew it. The letters had, unexpectedly, also resulted in a letter back. It arrived on a Wednesday, addressed to Mrs. Clara Mercer in handwriting that was careful and slightly formal in the way of a person who doesn't write many letters, but takes the ones they write seriously. The return address was Cincinnati. Rowan was at the table when she opened it. He watched her face as she read, watched the careful composure do the thing it did when something reached underneath it. Her throat moved once. Her hand tightened slightly on the paper. "My brother," she said, without looking up from the letter. He waited. He saw the piece in the territorial paper. Someone sent it to his aunt in Cincinnati, apparently. She read a little further. Her voice when she continued was lower than usual, with the particular texture of someone managing a strong feeling by speaking it carefully. "He says..." She stopped, started again. "He says he's glad I'm all right. He says the exclamation points in his letters have been partly real and partly for my benefit because he didn't want me to worry." A long pause. "He's 11 years old and he was managing my feelings about his feelings." Rowan said nothing. There wasn't anything useful to say to that, and Clara didn't need him to say something. She needed the room to have it. She set the letter down after a moment and looked at the window, the new window, the one with the 3-inch sill, and said, "I want him to come for the summer. If that's... I know it's not..." She stopped, reorganized. "He could stay in the back room before the school books arrive. It would only be a few weeks." "Clara." She looked at him. "He can come," Rowan said. "He can come for the summer, and he can come next summer, and if he decides he likes Arizona better than Cincinnati, he can come permanently. Write him tonight." Her expression did the thing it did sometimes, the careful composure thinning, the real thing showing through. It lasted only a moment. Then she picked up the letter, folded it along its original lines, and set it in the pocket of her apron with the particular precision of someone putting something valuable somewhere safe. "Thank you," she said. "You keep thanking me," he said. "You keep doing things worth thanking." He didn't have a response to that either. He went back to the fence post inventory he'd been working on, which needed doing and also gave him somewhere to look. It was 2 weeks after the community meeting and 3 weeks after the arrest that Rowan found the letters. He had been meaning to clear the storage room properly before the school books arrived. Claire's brother, whose name was Owen, was arriving in 12 days, and the room needed to be habitable before it became a schoolroom. The storage had accumulated over years, tools that didn't have a better place, boxes from after his parents died that he had moved in there and not opened because opening them had seemed, at the time, like something he could postpone indefinitely. He couldn't postpone it anymore. Most of the boxes were what he expected: his mother's extra kitchen things, his father's land survey records from the early years, a collection of veterinary pamphlets that his father had kept with an optimism that had not always been justified by outcomes. He worked through them methodically, the way he did most things, setting aside what could go to the barn and what was genuinely without purpose and what needed to be kept. The last box was smaller than the others. It was his father's, marked in his father's handwriting with nothing but a date, 1861, which was the year before Rowan was born. Inside were letters. Not many, 20, perhaps 25, tied with the length of twine that had dried and stiffened with age. The handwriting on the outside of the top letter was his father's. The handwriting on those ones underneath was his mother's, a script he recognized from the labels on preserved jars and the notations in the household ledger and the single birthday card she had made him when he turned 16, which he had kept in his coat pocket for 3 years until it fell apart. He sat down on the floor of the storage room, the future schoolroom, the room with the 3-inch windowsill, and read. His parents met in circumstances that, he had always understood, were complicated. His father had come west and had very little. His mother had family obligations she could not immediately leave. He knew that much as general history. What he had not known, had never been told, or perhaps had never asked, was the specific shape of it. The letters were from the year before the marriage. They were full of the particular awkward honesty of two people who are trying to tell the truth about a difficult situation to someone they have not yet earned the right to be fully honest with. His father, in his careful, slightly formal written hand, explaining that he needed a wife for a land claim he was trying to establish, and that he was aware this was an unusual way to begin a letter, but that he thought honesty was better than pretense. His mother, in 3 drafts that were clearly revised, the first 2 crossed out, the third sent, saying that she had her own reasons for needing a change of circumstance, and that she was not opposed to honesty as a starting point, and that she had questions. She had a great many questions. They were the sharpest, most direct questions Rowan had ever seen in writing, and reading them he felt, with a force that was almost physical, how completely his mother had been herself, always, including in the year before she became who she'd always been to him. The later letters were different, still his parents, still recognizably their voices, but with something else in them that had developed between the careful negotiation of the early ones. He read through them in the dim storage room light while the afternoon moved outside and didn't notice either the movement or the time. The last letter in the bundle was undated. It was short. His father's handwriting, but looser than usual, less careful. It said, "I want you to know that what started as necessity became everything else. I don't know that I could have predicted that. I'm not sure anyone can predict it. But I wanted it written down somewhere that I know the difference between what I thought I was getting into and what I actually got. The difference is the whole of it." Rowan sat with that for a long time. He heard Clara before he saw her, her step on the floorboard outside the storage room, the particular sound she made when she was moving through the house with purpose rather than wandering. She appeared in the doorway and looked at him on the floor with the box and the letters and whatever was showing on his face, and she didn't say anything. She looked at the letters and then at him and read the situation the way she read most situations, quickly, accurately, without making it about herself. She sat down on the floor across from him, not asking, just present. He handed her the last letter. She read it. When she looked up, her expression was the most unguarded he had seen it. "How long were they married?" she asked. 31 years, he said. She looked at the letter again. Read the last line once more. Set it down carefully on top of the others. He wrote it down so someone would know, she said, in case he never found the right way to say it out loud. That's what I think, Rowan said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The storage room was quiet and full of afternoon light from the new window, and outside somewhere a horse moved in the pasture and a bird made a brief, unambitious sound and was silent. I'm not going to Millhaven, Clara said. That was decided a while ago. I think we both know that. Yes, he said. And you're not going to keep riding out every few weeks and coming back bloody and pretending it's fine, she said, with a directness that had a slight edge to it, the edge of someone who has been thinking about this and has decided it needs to be said plainly. Not because I'm asking you to stop entirely. I understand that it's what you know, and there are people who depend on it being done, but not the way you've been doing it, alone, like you have nothing to come back to. He was quiet for a moment. You're saying I have something to come back to. I'm saying you have me, she said. Flat, clear, no decoration. The most Clara Winslow sentence he had ever heard. Which means when you go out on a job, you come back. That's not negotiable. He looked at her face, the set of it, the directness, the slight tightness around her eyes that was not composure, but was the effort of saying a true thing without protection around it. All right, he said, I mean it. I know you mean it, he said, but that's why I said all right. Something loosened in her expression. Not fully. Clara Winslow did not fully loosen. That was not her character, and he did not want it to be. But enough. The window looks good, she said, glancing at it. 3 inches, he said. Don't. He almost smiled, didn't quite. The school. When the books come, how many children did you say? 6 to start. Possibly 8 if the Ferris family sends both girls. She tilted her head slightly, considering. I'll need another shelf on the south wall. The current one isn't wide enough for the reading primers and the arithmetic books both. I can build a shelf. You can, she agreed, and there was something in the way she said it, not surprise, just an easy certainty, the kind that comes from knowing what someone is capable of, that settled into the room like the afternoon light, quiet and without drama, belonging there. They sat on the floor of the storage room with the letters between them until the light started going golden toward evening. Then Rowan carefully retied the bundle with the old twine and put it back in the box and set the box on the high shelf where it would be safe. Not in the barn with the things that didn't matter. On the shelf in the room that was going to be a school. Owen arrived on a Thursday, 12 days later, on the afternoon stage from Tucson. He was smaller than Rowan had pictured and more serious-looking, with Clara's same dark eyes and a way of assessing new situations that was so recognizably hers that Rowan had to look away briefly when the boy stepped off the stage and took in the town of Duskwater with the careful, evaluating attention of someone who has learned not to assume. Clara hugged him for a long time. He let her, with the particular composure of an 11-year-old boy who is very glad to see his sister and is not going to make a production of it. When she let go, Owen looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at him. You're the bounty hunter, Owen said. Retired, Rowan said. Mostly. Owen considered that. Clara's letter said you fixed a window. I did. She said you argued about the measurements. Rowan glanced at Clara, who had the expression of someone who writes detailed letters to 11-year-olds and is now facing the natural consequences. We discussed them, Rowan said carefully. She said you were right, Owen said. She told you that? Owen looked at him with the steady gravity of a boy who has been managing adult feelings for a year and has developed a reliable sense for what information is useful. She said you were right, and she was glad the shelf is already done too. Rowan looked at Clara. I tell him things, she said, without particular apology. Apparently, he said. Owen looked between them with the expression of a child who is watching adults navigate something and finding the navigation interesting. Then he picked up his bag and said, Can I see the horses? He was in the end exactly like his letters. The exclamation points were real and also slightly performed, which was not dishonesty, but was the specific coping mechanism of a boy who had learned that seeming all right made the people he loved feel better, which meant he could feel worse in private, and it cost less. Rowan recognized that mechanism because he had used a version of it himself for most of his adult life. They didn't discuss it directly. Instead, Owen spent 4 days following Rowan around the property with the natural gravitational pull of a boy who has been in a city for a year and has been starved for outdoor work to put his hands to. He was useful, genuinely, not in the token way children are sometimes allowed to be useful. He could read Pepper's moods correctly by the third day, which was faster than most adults managed. He had a good eye for which fence posts were starting to work loose. On the fifth evening, sitting on the porch while Clara was inside finishing the arrangement of the school shelves, Rowan had built two in the end because the second wall had also turned out to need one. Owen said, without looking up from the post he was whittling, "Are you going to stay married?" Rowan looked at him. "Yes." "For real, or just the legal part?" "For real," Rowan said. Owen whittled for a moment. "She was lonely," he said. "In Ohio, before everything happened. I don't think she knew it because she was busy, but I could tell." He paused. "She's not lonely now." Rowan looked at the boy for a long moment, this small, serious person who had been watching the adults around him with more attention than any of them had probably credited. "No," he said, "she's not." Owen nodded, satisfied, and went back to his post. The school opened on the first Monday of September. 6 children, ages 6 to 13, arrived on the Mercer property with the various expressions of children approaching a new situation, some cautious, one openly enthusiastic, one clearly furious about being made to attend and determined to make that position known through body language alone. Clara met them on the porch with the manner of someone who has handled every version of that range before and finds it manageable. Rowan watched from the barn doorway. He watched Clara direct them inside, heard her voice through the window. Level, clear, already finding the specific way to address each of them individually, and stayed where he was because the moment did not need him in it, and he understood that about it. What he understood, standing in the barn doorway with his hands in his pockets, and the September morning light falling across the yard, and the sound of Clara's voice coming through the schoolroom window, was something his father had understood and had written down in a letter he'd kept in a box for 30 years, just in case the right person found it at the right moment. The difference is the whole of it. He had spent 6 years fighting to keep a piece of land, riding hard country, taking dangerous jobs, bleeding for a deed and an acreage, and the legal right to a name on a paper. And the land mattered. It still mattered. It had always mattered. But it had been, he understood now, a proxy. A thing he could point to and say, "This is what I'm fighting for," because the real thing, the thing under the land, the thing the land was a container for, was harder to name and harder to defend and required a different kind of courage than anything he'd ever done on the trail. It required the courage of staying, of letting something matter enough that losing it would be devastating, of accepting that you could not maintain the safe, controlled distance of a man who travels light and leaves before things get complicated. He had not been good at that. He had been, by his own honest assessment, quite bad at it. Clara had walked into a burning situation with 4 days' notice and no guarantee of anything, and had stayed anyway, not because she had nowhere else to go. She had Millhaven, she had options. She was a capable person who would have built something wherever she landed, but because she had looked at the ranch and the man and the community around it and made a decision about what was worth standing beside. He had not deserved that at the start. He was not certain he deserved it now, but he understood that deserving wasn't always the mechanism. Sometimes the mechanism was showing up and continuing to show up and building something in the space between two people who have decided to keep showing up regardless of how uncertain the original arrangement was. His parents had understood that. They'd written it in letters in 1861 and lived it for 31 years and left it in a box for him to find when he was ready to understand it. He was ready now. From the schoolroom window, a child laughed. The short, surprised laugh of someone who has encountered something unexpectedly interesting, which was its own kind of testament to Clara Winslow's capacity as a teacher. Rowan went back to the fence inventory. There was still the north section to assess before winter, and the barn roof's compromised section needed addressing before the first serious rain, and the south pasture water situation was going to require some real thought when the dry season deepened. There was always something on a working ranch. There was always the next thing. The difference was that now, working through the list of what needed doing, he felt the work differently. Not as the effort of maintaining something against entropy and loss, as the work of building something, adding to something, making something better than it had been before he touched it. That was different. That was everything. In October, the first ruling in the Hawthorne federal case came down from Phoenix. 11 families received formal notices that their fraudulent debt instruments were voided. 3 of the properties wrongfully transferred were ordered restored to their original owners pending final judgment. Ellis Wade drove out to the ranch to tell Rowan personally, and Rowan read the notice carefully and then set it on the kitchen table and said, "What about the others, the remaining families?" "Coming," Wade said. "These things take time, but it's coming." "Tell them," Rowan said. "All of them. Don't let them sit with it." "That's what Clara's letters have been doing," Wade said, with the particular tone of a man who finds a situation more impressive than he expected. "I know," Rowan said. "Tell them anyway." Clara, coming in from the schoolroom with chalk dust on her sleeve and the distracted energy of someone who has just finished something absorbing, read the notice over Rowan's shoulder and said, "Who's writing to the Grady family? They're in the northeast section and they don't read the papers." "You are, apparently," Wade said. "Then I need to know the legal language from this ruling," she said, sitting down across from Wade with the focused attention that still, 3 months in, caught people slightly off guard. "Specifically the instrument voiding clause. And I need to know if the same language applies to the Grady situation or if their case is categorically different." Wade looked at his notes. Rowan went to make coffee because there was going to be a detailed legal discussion, and detailed legal discussions went better with coffee. From the schoolroom window, which he could see from the kitchen, the afternoon light was falling at the particular angle that made the new shelves show their grain, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had built those shelves better than he needed to, better than purely functional required. He had built them well because they were in a room that deserved well-built things. He didn't examine that thought too closely. He just knew it was true. That evening, after Wade had gone and the schoolroom was quiet, and Owen was asleep in his room, he had not gone back to Cincinnati when September came, and nobody had raised the subject, and the aunt in Cincinnati had received a letter that Clara had written with Owen, looking over her shoulder and nodding at each paragraph. Rowan and Clara sat on the porch in the October cool, not talking, not needing to. The valley spread below the ridgeline in its nighttime arrangement, distant lights from the Hale property, the faint silhouette of the Alcott barn on the southern edge, the stars above the Arizona high desert doing what they did, which was remind anyone who was paying attention that the world was older and larger than any single story in it. Clara had her hands around a cup and was looking at the ridge, and Rowan was looking at the same ridge and at her, in the way he'd developed of looking at both at once, which was new to him and seemed to be becoming natural. "Owen asked me this morning if he could help Pike with the cattle work on Saturdays," she said. "What did you say?" "I said it was up to you." "It's up to him," Rowan said. "And yes." She nodded, quiet for a moment. "Then, he's happy here." "I know." "I didn't expect that," she said. "I hoped for it, but I didn't count on it." Rowan looked at her. "Are you?" She looked back at him. The question was clear and she knew it and she didn't deflect it, which was one of the things about her that had never changed from the first night. She did not deflect direct questions. She answered them, or she said she wasn't ready to answer them, but she didn't pretend they hadn't been asked. "Yes," she said, simply. The same plainness she'd brought to "I have something to come back to." The same plainness his father had used in that final undated letter. The plainness of people who have decided that the truth, said clearly, is better than the performance of a more complicated answer. The valley held its nighttime quiet around them. The ranch held its lights. The schoolroom held its new shelves and its chalk dust and the particular quality of a room that is being used for what it was meant for. And Rowan Mercer, who had spent 6 years fighting to keep a piece of ground and had won in ways he had not expected and could not have planned, sat on his porch beside his wife and felt the full, undefended weight of a life that was actually his. Not held at arm's length, not managed from a safe distance, but his, completely, with all the vulnerability and permanence that word carried. The valley, in the end, was not what had been saved. The valley had saved itself, the way places do when the people in them decide they belong to each other as much as they belong to the land. What had been saved, built, really, out of necessity and paper and midnight coffee and a 3-inch windowsill and a box of old letters found at exactly the right time, was something smaller and more durable than any acreage. It was simply this: the porch, the cup, the ridgeline, The woman beside him who had walked into chaos without guarantees and stayed without being asked, and who would, he knew with the certainty of someone who has finally learned to recognize the real thing, keep staying. Not because the agreement required it, because she wanted to. That was the whole of it. That was always the whole of it. And the Arizona night held them both, and the stars did their old, indifferent, magnificent work overhead. And in the schoolroom, the chalk dust settled on the shelves that had been built to last. And the valley, slow and certain as the seasons, grew into something it had always had the shape of. A home where people knew they were not alone in it.